Why are we antisemites? Hofbräuhaus Festsaal, Munich, August 13, 1920. My dear fellow Germans, we are already used to being called monsters, and it is perceived as particularly monstrous that we are in the vanguard on the question that most unnerves certain gentlemen in Germany today, namely the question of opposition to the Jews. Our people understand so much, but this one thing we do not want to understand, and above all because the worker asks, what does the Jewish question have to do with the workers at all? Indeed, the majority of our people today still have no idea what the actual situation is with regard to this question. The vast majority perhaps only deals with this question emotionally and immediately judges. Well, I have seen good and bad people among them, just as among ourselves. Very few have learned to judge from objective observation. This is where I will draw a connection with the word work. What does work actually mean? Work is an activity that one does not perform for one's own sake, but for the benefit of one's fellow men. If anything distinguishes man from animal, it is precisely his work, which is not only guided by instinct, etc., but is based on the pure recognition of a certain necessity. Hardly any revolution has had such a profound effect on this earth as this slow one, which has gradually turned the lazy man of primeval times into the man of work. We can assume here that this activity has followed three great stages. First of all, the purely instinctive drive for self-preservation. We find it not only in man, but also in animals, and this instinctive drive for self-preservation later developed into another form of work, namely, work for purely selfish reasons. This second stage of work was also gradually overcome, and the third came, work out of a sense of moral duty, which the individual does not do only because he is compelled to do it. Today, we can see it everywhere, the work which millions of people do without being driven to it constantly, which binds thousands of intellectuals to their study day after day through the night, without perhaps being materially compelled to do this work, which makes hundreds of thousands of German workers wander into their home gardens after the end of the workday, and we can see that today millions of people cannot live at all without some kind of occupation. And when I said earlier that this may well be a slow but perhaps the greatest revolution that mankind has undergone so far, then one must assume that this revolution too must have had a certain cause, and this cause is again the greatest goddess on this earth, the one who is able to drive man to the extreme, the goddess of hardship. We can trace this hardship on this earth back to ancient times, especially in the northern part of the world, in those enormous ice deserts, in those places which offered only the most meager existence. Here man was forced for the first time to fight for his existence in practice. What the smiling south offered him in abundance without work, he had to win through his labor in the north, and so perhaps the first groundbreaking invention was born here. In these cold stretches, man was forced to seek a substitute for the only gift of heaven that makes life possible, the sun, and the man who first artificially produced the spark later appeared to mankind as a god, Prometheus, the fire-bringer. The north forced people to further activity, making clothing, building their own dwellings, caves, and later houses. In short, it practically gave birth to the principle of work. Without it, existence up there would have been impossible. Even if it was still modest, it was already an activity that had to be planned in advance, which the individual knew that if he failed to carry out, he would hopelessly starve to death in the following hard winter. And at the same time, a second development took place. The enormous hardship and the terrible privation acted as a means of racial purification. What was weak and sickly could not survive this terrible period, but sank prematurely into the grave, leaving a race of giants in strength and health. And a further characteristic was born in this race. Where men are externally muzzled, where their sphere of action is externally limited, their inner life begins to develop. Externally limited, inwardly unlimited. The more man must depend on himself due to external forces, the deeper his inner life becomes, and the more he turns inward. These three achievements, the recognized principle of work as a duty, a necessity, not only for the individual and out of egoism, but for the existence of the whole clan, even if that was often only a very small group of people. Secondly, the necessity of physical health and thus mental health. And thirdly, the deep inner spiritual life. These gave the Nordic races the ability to expand over the rest of the world and form states. Even if this power could not be expressed in the far north, it became capable of taking effect at the moment when the ice shackles fell away and man moved down to the south into a favorable, happy, free nature. We know that all these people had one sign in common, the sign of the sun. They created cults based on light and created a sign, the tool of fire generation, the whirl, the sun cross. One finds this cross as a swastika, not only here in Europe, but just as much in India and Japan, carved into temple posts. It is the swastika of the communities once founded by Aryan culture. So we must ask ourselves, what about the Jew and the formation of states? Does the Jew also possess the power to build states, and so on? We must first of all examine his attitude to work, how he actually perceives the principle of work, and you must excuse me now for quoting a little book called the Bible. I do not wish to claim that everything in it is necessarily correct, for we know that Jury worked on it very liberally, but at least one thing is certain, that it was not written by any anti-Semite. This is significant because no anti-Semite could have written a more terrible indictment against the Jewish race than the Bible, especially the Old Testament. We must pick out one sentence, "By the sweat of thy brow shalt thou earn thy bread." And it says here that this was determined as punishment for the fall. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where a whole world separates us, because we cannot see work as a punishment, otherwise we should all be convicts. But we do not want to see it as a punishment either. I must confess, I could not be without work, and hundreds of thousands and millions would perhaps endure 3, 5, 10 days, but could not live 90 or 100 days without activity. If this paradise really existed, this so-called land of milk and honey, our people would not be happy there. We seek the chance for activity no matter what, and if Germans have no other possibility, we will make do with bashing each other's heads in, at least temporarily. We would not be able to endure absolute rest. Here we see a great difference, for a Jew wrote this down, and whether it is all true or not, it corresponds to Judaism's conception of work itself. For them, work is not a self-evident moral duty, but at the most, only a means for the preservation of one's own self. That is not work in our eyes. For if I explain that word in this way, then any activity at all, by which one supports oneself, without regard for one's fellow men, could be called work. And we know that this work once consisted in the plundering of traveling caravans, and that today it consists in the coordinated plundering of indebted peasants, industrialists, townsfolk, and so on. The form has changed, but the principle is the same. We do not call it work, but robbery. If already this first fundamental concept separates us, a second one immediately separates us further. I explained to you earlier that this great period in the north purified the Nordic races. This means that everything inferior and weak gradually died out of these races, and that only the healthiest bodies remained. Here too the Jew differs, for he did not become purified, but inbred. He has, to be sure, multiplied unsurpassed, but only in his own circles and without any selection pressure, and thus we see the growth of a race which bears all the defects inherent to inbreeding. Finally, the Jew still lacks the third trait, inner spiritual experience. I do not need to describe how the Jew appears in general. You all know him. That incessant restlessness which never gives him the opportunity to gather himself inwardly, to give himself over to a spiritual mood. At the most solemn moment his eyes dart about, and you see how even during the most beautiful opera, the man is still calculating dividends. The Jew has never possessed an artistry of his own. He has had his temples built by foreign builders, first by Assyrians, then, during the second reconstruction, by Roman artisans. He personally has left no cultural arts, no other visual works, no buildings, nothing at all. And musically, too, we know nothing except that he is capable of copying the music of others well. I do not wish to conceal the fact that today we have many famous conductors from their ranks, who have become famous thanks to a Jewish press that is coordinated down to the last whistle. If a people lacks these three qualities, it cannot be state building. This holds true, for the Jew, through the long centuries, has always been nomadic, albeit on the grandest scale. He never had what we would call a state. It is a great misconception, even among us today, that Jerusalem was the capital of a Jewish nation-state. First of all, in those days the gulf between the Jews of the tribe of Judah and Caleb and the northern Israelite tribes was still practically unbridged, and it was only David who succeeded in bridging this gulf and gradually creating a union through the unified cult of the God Yahweh. We know precisely that this cult chose Jerusalem as its sole seat of power only at a very late stage, and that only from that moment on did the Jewish people receive a headquarters exactly like they have today in, for example, Berlin or New York or Warsaw, etc. It was a city in which, thanks to their other abilities and characteristics, they gradually gained the upper hand, partly by force of arms and partly by force of trumpets. Even then, the Jew lived primarily as a parasite on the body of other peoples, and it had to be that way. For a people who do not want to perform work themselves, the sometimes thankless work of forming and maintaining a state, working in the mines, in the factories, in construction, all this work so unpleasant for a Hebrew, such a people will never found a state itself, but will always prefer to live as a third party in another state, where this work is done by others, and he is only a middleman in business, a merchant at best, or translated into today's German, a robber, a nomad, who undertakes the same raids he once undertook. Thus it becomes immediately apparent why the whole project for the foundation of a Zionist state is nothing more than a comedy. The chief rabbi in Jerusalem has now assured us that the most important thing would not be the founding of this state, because it is very doubtful whether this can yet be realized, but it is also not necessary, because Jewry needs this city at the most, as a spiritual center. In fact, we have already become the masters of a whole series of states. We dominate them financially, economically, and also politically. Thus, the goal of this Zionist state is nothing more than to pull the wool over the eyes of the unsuspecting. They try to explain that so-and-so many Jews have found themselves wanting to go there as farmers, as workers, even as soldiers. If they really had this instinct in them, the German Reich would need these ideal people today to cut peat, to work in the coal mines. They could participate in the development of our great projects, our hydropower plants, our lakes, and so on, but it does not occur to them. The whole Zionist state will be nothing but an academy for their international schemes, and from there everything will be directed, and every Jew will receive, as it were, an immunity as a citizen of the Palestinian state. And besides, he will naturally keep our rights as a citizen. But if you should catch a Jew red-handed, he will longer be a German citizen, but a citizen of Palestine. One might say that the Jew cannot help it, that it all stems from his race. He cannot overcome it, and therefore it does not matter whether the individual is good or evil. He must act exactly according to the law of his race, from which he cannot detach himself, as do our people. Even when confronted with the fiercest Spartacist, the sheep-like good-naturedness of the present German shines through, for he only turns his rage against the other side, and is good-natured enough that he does not notice who is pulling the strings. The Jew is everywhere a Jew, who resolutely represents the interests of his race, whether consciously or unconsciously. We can already see that there are two great racial differences here. Aryanism means a moral conception of work, and thus what we so often talk about today. Socialism, community spirit, the common good before self-interest. Jewry means an egoistic conception of work, and thus mammonism and materialism, the opposite of socialism. And from this trait, which he cannot overcome, which is in his blood, he himself recognizes this. From this trait alone comes the absolute necessity for the Jew to act in a state-destroying manner. He cannot do otherwise whether he wants to or not. He is thus not capable of forming a state of his own, for that more or less always presupposes a great deal of community spirit. He is thus only able to live as a parasite in other states, as a race within other races, as a state within other states. And we see here quite clearly that the race in itself does not have a state-building capacity if it does not possess definite traits which are inherent in the race, which must be in its blood, and that conversely a race which does not possess. These traits must have an state-destroying effect, regardless of whether the individual is good or evil. We can trace the fate of Jewry from the earliest times. It is not necessary that everything written in the Bible should be true word for word, but on the whole it gives at least an impression of the history of Jewry as the Jews wrote it for themselves. And there we see that the Jew writes this work quite innocuously. It does not seem outrageous to him when he describes how, by cunning and deceit, he penetrated and contaminated race after race, was always expelled, and, without being offended, sought out another, how he pimped and haggled when it came to his ideals, ready to sacrifice even his family. We know that a gentleman recently stayed here, Sigmund Frankl, who most recently wrote that it would be quite unfair to accuse the Jews of having a materialistic spirit, for just look at the sunny, intimate family life of the Jew. This intimate family life did not for a moment prevent their own patriarch Abraham from immediately pimping his own wife to the Pharaoh of Egypt, just so that he could do business. And this is their patriarch and progenitor. And just as the Lord Papa was, so the sons have become, and have never spurned these deals. And you can be sure that they do not spurn them even today. Anyone who is a soldier will remember that in Galicia or Poland, he could see these Abrahams standing at every railway station. For thousands of years, the Jew has been forcing his way into other races, and we know very well that whenever he has lived somewhere for a long time, the signs of collapse have made themselves felt, and that in the end, the peoples have no choice but to rid themselves of the unwanted guest or to perish themselves. We know that heavy plagues came upon the nations. There were 10 of them that came upon Egypt. We are experiencing the same plague today. And finally, the Egyptians ran out of patience. When the chronicler describes that the Jew was the acquiescent one and finally left, it cannot have been so, for they had hardly left when they began to long for the flesh pots again. So it seems that in reality they did not fare so badly. But even supposing it to be true that the Egyptians used them in building their pyramids, this is quite the same as if we today proposed to give this race gainful employment in our mines, quarries, etc. And just as today, you would not see this race go there voluntarily. You would probably not see them build pyramids voluntarily in Egypt. And there was no choice but to force them. What hundreds of thousands of others do, as a matter of course, to the Jews represents another chapter of Jew baiting and pogroms. What does the term industrial capital actually mean? Ladies and gentlemen, we are reproached, especially in the factories. You are not fighting industrial capital, but only stock exchange and finance capital. Very few understand that industrial capital cannot be fought at all. What does industrial capital even mean? It is a factor that changes gradually in size, only a relative concept. Once it meant needle and thread, the workshop, and perhaps the few pennies of savings that the master tailor in Nuremberg possessed in the 13th century. This was the sum that he needed in order to work, i.e. tools, workshop, and a certain amount of money to enable him to live for a certain time. Gradually the small workshop became the great factory, and we see practically the same thing. For the small weaving frame of its time later became the mechanical loom, but the latter is just as much a tool as the loom of the most primitive design, and the workshop, once a small room, has become a great factory. But workshop and tool, machine and factory, in and of themselves, do not generate value, but are only a means to an end, only generating value when work is done with them. The thing that produces value is work, and the few cents that perhaps the small master craftsman possessed in order to get through hard times, in order to buy materials, have increased tenfold and 100-fold and stand before us again today, only now we call it capital for the maintenance of the business in bad times, i.e. working capital. I would like to emphasize one thing. Tools, workshops, machines or factories, working capital, industrial capital, you cannot fight against this at all. You can perhaps see to it that it is not abused, but you cannot fight it. This is the great fraud perpetrated on our people, and it is perpetrated in order to divert them from the real struggle, in order to tear them away from the capital that ought to be fought and must be fought, loan and finance capital. This form of capital arises in a fundamentally different way. While the smallest master craftsman is dependent on the fates that may affect him day to day, on the general situation, in the Middle Ages perhaps, on the size of his town and its prosperity, on the security of this town, today too this capital, industrial capital, is bound to the state, to the people, dependent on the will of the people to work, but also on the possibility of procuring raw materials, to be able to offer work, of finding customers who will actually buy the product. And we know perfectly well that a collapse of the state can, under certain circumstances, devalue the greatest assets, rendering them worthless. This is in contrast to the other form of capital, stock exchange and loan capital, on which interest is paid quite evenly without any consideration of whether or not the owner, on whose estate, for example, these 10,000 marks lie, goes to ruin himself. The debts remain on the estate. We can see that a state has debts. For example, the German Reich has bonds on the Alsace-Lorraine railways, and these bonds must bear interest, even though we no longer own the railways. We know that the railways today, fortunately, have a deficit of 20 billion, but their bonds must bear interest. And although they were partly sold 60 years ago, and have already been repaid 4 times over, the debt remains, the interest continues to accrue. And while a great nation no longer gains anything for this enterprise, but still has to bleed, this loan capital continues to grow quite evenly, regardless of any outside disturbance. Here we already see the first possibility, namely that this form of multiplication of money, which is necessarily independent of all the events and incidents of ordinary life, because it is never hindered and always continues uniformly, will gradually lead to gigantic sums of capital, which become so enormous that in the end they have only one fault: the difficulty of accommodating them. In order to accommodate this capital, one must proceed to destroy entire states, to annihilate entire cultures, to abolish national industries, not in order to make them public, but in order to throw all this into the jaws of international capital. For this capital is indeed international. As the only thing on this earth which is truly international, it is international because its bearers, the Jews, are international due to their spread over the whole world. And already here everyone should smack his head and say to himself, if this capital is international because its bearers, the Jews, are spread internationally over the whole world, then it must be madness to think that this capital can be fought internationally by the same members of this race. Fire is not extinguished by fire, but by water, and international capital, which belongs to international Jews, can only be broken by national force. Thus this capital has grown, and today dominates practically the whole earth with its immeasurable sums, incomprehensible in its great proportions, growing uncannily, and worst of all, completely corrupting all honest labor. For therein lies the dreadful thing. The ordinary man, who today has to bear the burden of paying interest on this capital, must see how, in spite of diligence, assiduity, thrift, in spite of real labor, he has scarcely enough left to feed himself and still less to clothe himself, while at the same time this international capital is devouring billions in interest alone, which he must help to raise, at the same time as a racial stratum spreads in the state, which does no other work than to collect interest and cut coupons for itself. This leads to the degradation of all honest work. For every honest working person today must ask himself, what is the purpose of my productivity at all? I'll never get anywhere. And there are people who can not only live practically without working, but who essentially even dominate us. And that is the goal. One of the foundations of our strength is to be destroyed, namely the moral conception of labor. And this was also the brilliant idea of Karl Marx, to change the moral conception of labor, to organize the whole mass of people who were struggling under capital and marshal them for the destruction of the national economy and the protection of international stock exchange and loan capital. We know that today 15 billion worth of industrial capital faces 300 billion worth of loan capital. This 15 billion in industrial capital is invested in productive value, while we have to pay back this 300 billion in loan capital, which we only receive by the spoonful in installments of 6 and 7 billion, and which we use up in periods of 1 to 2 months to supplement our rations a little. And if we should ever recover this 6 to 7 billion which is decreed to us today in completely worthless scraps of paper, will have to be repaid later on in high-quality money, i.e. in money which is backed by practical work. This means not only the destruction of a state, but the donning of a shackle. Finally, the Jew's last resort is destroying everything that one would regard as necessary for a state to be considered cultured. It is perhaps here that his work is most difficult to recognize, but it is also here that it actually has the most terrible effect. We recognize his activity in art, how today's painting becomes a caricature of everything we might call true inner feeling. People always explain that you just don't understand, that this is the inner experience of the artist. Do you think that what a Moritz Schwind or Ludwig Richter created did not also reflect an inward experience? At the end of the day, do you believe that Beethoven's chords do not also come from an inner experience and feeling, or that a Beethoven symphony is not also an inner experience? It is true inner experience as opposed to the other form, which is only a superficial swindle, deliberately put into the world in order to gradually destroy every healthy conception of the world, in order to gradually stir people into a state in which one no longer knows whether these times are crazy or whether he himself is crazy. Just as he works in painting, sculpture, and music, so he does in poetry, and above all in literature. Here he has a great advantage. He is the editor, and above all the publisher, of more than 95% of all the newspapers that are published. He makes full use of this power, and anyone who has become such an anti-Semitic monster as I am can smell where the Jew begins as soon as he picks up the newspaper. You can already tell from the title page that this is not one of us, but one of the people behind the scenes. One knows perfectly well that all his wordplay and cunning only cover up the inner hollowness of his spirit, only conceal the fact that the man knows no spiritual feeling or experience, and what he lacks in true spirit he replaces with a swarm of phrases, verbal tricks, and turns of phrase which seem maddening, but it is preemptively declared from the outset that whoever does not understand them is simply not sufficiently developed intellectually. Speaking of literature, we must also jump to another chapter in which we can appropriately admire Moritz Wolf and Salomon Baer. Our theaters, the places that Richard Wagner once wished darkened in order to produce the greatest degree of consecration and seriousness, in which he wanted to perform works that he was ashamed to call mere plays, and called instead consecration plays, the place where there should be nothing but the highest elevation, the detachment of the individual from all sorrow and misery, but also from all the rottenness that we otherwise unfortunately encounter on God's earth, that is supposed to lift the individual into a purer air. What has become of it? A place where one is ashamed to enter today, lest someone should recognize you when you walk in. We see that a Friedrich Schiller may have received 346 thalers for Mary Stuart, but that one receives 3.5 million today for A Merry Widow. That one earns millions today for the greatest kitsch, for which an author in ancient Greece would probably have been exiled from the state. And if the theater has thus become a breeding ground for vice and shamelessness, then this applies 1,000 times more to that new invention, which perhaps originated from a flash of inspiration, and which the Jew immediately understood how to transform into the dirtiest business imaginable, the cinema. At first, one could only attach the greatest hopes to these ingenious inventions, the easy transmission of profound knowledge to a whole people and the whole world. And what has become of it? The vehicle for the greatest filth and shamelessness. And so the Jew works on. For him there is no spiritual feeling, and just as his forefather Abraham pimped out his wife, so he finds nothing unusual about pimping girls today. And we can find him everywhere, in North America as well as in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and throughout the Orient, throughout the centuries as the trafficker of human flesh. And it cannot be denied, even the greatest defender of the Jews cannot deny, that almost all these traffickers in girls are Hebrews. Here one can find truly horrific material. To Germanic sensibilities, there should be only one punishment here, death. For people who play fast and loose with this, treating as a business, as a commodity, that which for millions of other means the greatest happiness or the greatest misery, the penalty would be death. To the Jews, however, love is nothing but a business with which they earn money. They are ready at any time to tear apart the happiness of any marriage, as long as they can get their 30 pieces of silver out of it. We know that today they tell us that all that which is called family life is a completely outdated notion from the past, and anyone who saw the play Schloss Wetterstein could experience here how shamelessly the most sacred thing left to a people is described as nothing more than a brothel. So we should not be surprised if the Jew boldly attacks the last thing that many people still care about today, the last thing that can at least give many people inner peace: religion. Here too, we see the same Jew who has enough religious customs of his own for which others might easily mock him, but for which no one mocks him, because we never mock religion, as it remains sacred to us. But he pulls it off. He reaches everywhere, destroys everywhere, and can offer no substitute anywhere. Whoever is detached from religion today, in this age of the vilest deceit and fraud, has only two possibilities. Either he despairs and hangs himself, or he becomes a thug. And when we see, for example, in these Jewish journals, how they dictate that every Jew is obliged to enter the struggle against every anti-Semite, whoever and wherever he may be, then it follows that every German, whoever and wherever he may be, must become an anti-Semite. For if the Jew has a racial determination, so do we, and we are obliged to carry it out. For it seems to us inseparable from the social idea, and we do not believe that a state can ever exist on earth with lasting internal health if it is not built on internal social justice. And so we have joined forces in this knowledge, and when we finally came together, there was only one big question: how should we actually christen ourselves? As a party? A bad name. Notorious, discredited in the mouths of everyone, and hundreds asked us, "Why did you call yourselves a party?" When I hear that word, I go mad, and others explain to us, it's completely unnecessary for us to organize ourselves officially. It is enough to spread systematic knowledge of the danger of Jewry, and the individual, on the basis of this knowledge, can begin to remove the Jewish influence from himself. I very much suspect that this whole beautiful train of thought was devised by none other than a Jew himself. They then went on to tell us, it is not necessary to organize politically. It is sufficient to take away the Jew's economic power. Only organize economically, that is where salvation and the future lie. Here too, I assume that it was a Jew who first put forth this idea, for one thing has become clear to us. In order to free our economy from these vices, it is necessary to fight the pathogen in the politically organized struggle of the masses against their oppressors. It was clear to us that systematic knowledge is worthless, and its deepening can serve no purpose unless it becomes the basis for an organization of the masses to carry out what we feel is necessary on the basis of our knowledge, and that only the broad masses of our people can be considered for this organization. For in this, we differ from all those who are still would-be saviors of Germany today, whether Bothmer or Ballestedt and so on, that we are of the opinion that this future strength of our people is not to be sought in the Odeon bar or the Bonbonniere, but in the countless workshops into which that strength flows day after day and out at noon and evening, that the only hope of our people for the future lies in these millions of hard-working, healthy people. We realize that if this movement does not reach the broad masses, if it does not organize them, then everything is in vain. Then we will never succeed in liberating our people, and we will never be able to think of rebuilding our fatherland. Salvation will never come from above. It can and will only come from the broad masses, from the bottom up. And when we came to this realization and decided to form a party, a political party that wishes to enter uncompromisingly into the political struggle for the future, another voice rang out to us. Do you believe that you few will be able to achieve this? Do you really believe that you few men can do this? For we realized that we were indeed facing an immeasurable struggle, but that nothing had yet been created on earth by men that other men could not destroy, and a further conviction arose within us that it could not be a question of whether we think we can do it. If it is right and necessary, then it is no longer a question of whether we want to do it, but of our duty to do what we feel is necessary. We did not ask for money and supporters, but we decided to go forth, and when others are working for a whole lifetime to get perhaps a little house, or to create a carefree old age for themselves, then we truly consider it worth living to have begun this most difficult struggle. Should we win, and we are convinced that we will, we may go to the grave destitute, but we will have helped to bring about the great movement that will now sweep across Europe and the whole world. First of all, we were clear about three principles which are inseparable from each other. Socialism as the ultimate conception of duty, the moral duty of work, not for one's own sake, but also for the sake of one's fellow men, above all, abiding by the principle of common good before individual good, struggle against all parasitism, and especially against easy and unearned income. And we were aware that in this struggle we could rely on no one but our own people. We were convinced that socialism in this sense can only be found among nations and races which are Aryan, and here we hope and are convinced, first and foremost for our own people's sake, that socialism is therefore inseparable from nationalism. For us, being nationalists does not mean belonging to one party or another, but rather examining every action to see whether it benefits the whole people, and love for the whole people without exception. From this conception we will understand that it is necessary to safeguard the most precious thing that a people possesses, the sum of all the active creative powers of its workers, whether of the fist or of the mind, healthy in body and soul. And this conception of the national immediately forces us to take a stand against the opposite, the Semitic conception of the people, and above all against the Semitic conception of work. And if we are socialists, then we must necessarily be anti-Semites, since we wish to fight against materialism and mammonism. And if today the Jew still runs into our factories and cries, "How can you as a socialist be anti-Semitic? Aren't you ashamed?" the time will come when we will ask, how can you as a socialist not be anti-Semitic? The time is coming when it will be self-evident that socialism can only be carried out in the company of nationalism and anti-Semitism. The three concepts are inseparably linked. They are the foundations of our program, and that is why we call ourselves National Socialists. Finally, we know how great the social reforms are which must be carried out, that Germany will not recover only on the basis of small efforts, but that we will have to make radical changes. We will not be able to avoid the national problem, or the problem of land reform, or providing for all those who work day after day for the national community in their old age, that their provision is not a pittance, but that they have a right to spend these old days in a way that is still worth living. If we want to carry out these social reforms, they must go hand in hand with the struggle against the opponent of every social institution, Jewry. Here, too, we know perfectly well that systematic knowledge can only be the groundwork, but that behind this knowledge must come the organization which will one day put it into action, and in this action, the removal of the Jews from our people, we will remain adamant. Not because we begrudge them their existence, we congratulate the whole rest of the world on their visit, but because the existence of our own people is 1,000 times more important to us than that of a foreign race. And we are convinced that this systematic anti-Semitism, which clearly recognizes the terrible danger of this race for every nation, can only be a guide, but that the broad masses will always perceive the matter emotionally and will come to know the Jew first and foremost as the man in daily life, who always and everywhere sticks out. Our concern must be to awaken and stir up and incite the instinct against Jewry in our people until they come to the decision to join the movement that is ready to bear the consequences. If we are told, yes, whether you are successful depends in the end on whether you have enough money, etc., then I believe I can say the following: even the power of money is limited. There is a certain limit beyond which, in the end, it is no longer money that rules, but truth. And we are all aware that once the millions of our workers have recognized who the leaders are, who are always promising them today to lead them towards a blissful future kingdom, once they realize how gold is at play everywhere, they will throw the gold in their faces and declare, "Keep your gold, and don't think you can buy us." And we are least likely to despair, even if we still stand alone today. If we see supporters everywhere we go, but nowhere the courage to organize, that should not make us mad. We have dared to fight, and we must win nonetheless. I assured you before the voting that this election would not decide Germany's fate, that there would be no recovery after this election, and today I think most people will already agree with me. I guaranteed you this then because I knew very well that courage and the will to act were lacking everywhere. And I told you only one thing as our election program: let the others go to the polls today, to the Reichstag, to the parliaments, and stretch out in their club chairs. We want to get up on the beer hall table and sweep the masses along with us. We have kept this promise and will keep it in the future. Restlessly, unceasingly, as long as there is still a spark of strength in us and a breath in our lungs, we will go out and call upon all our people and speak the truth again and again, until we can finally hope that this truth will triumph, that the day will finally come when our words will fall silent and action will begin. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not at all as fearsome as our main enemy and cannot immediately crush Jewry by ourselves, nor do we imagine it to be so easy. But we have decided that we will not come with ifs and buts, and that once the matter has been resolved, it will be done thoroughly. To the gentleman who said it is all the same to him, if someone is a human being, he is a human being. That in itself I can accept, as long as this other human being does not get in my way. But if a great race consistently destroys the living conditions of my race, I don't say, I don't care where they come from. In that case, I say I am one of those who, if they get a slap on the left cheek, give 2 or 3 back. Then the gentleman said that our movement would mean a struggle into which the workers would be drawn. Yes, and they promise our people God knows what kingdoms of heaven, as the fools have done for 40 years, and now instead of the kingdom of heaven have nothing but a pile of rubble and misery. We do not go along with that. We do not promise a kingdom of heaven, only this one thing, that if you are willing to carry out this reform in Germany, perhaps the time will come again when the individual can live. If you carry out the glorious reforms which these other gentlemen here desire, you will in an even shorter time be faced with the necessity of embellishing this life by means of the very same decrees which their leader Trotsky, Lenin, and so on are now issuing. Whoever is not prepared to fight for the blessings of this state will die. Finally, he said they were opposed to any form of capitalism. Ladies and gentlemen, the communists have hitherto fought only industrial capital and hanged only industrial capitalists. But name me one Jewish capitalist whom they have hanged. 300,000 Russians have practically been murdered in Russia. The Soviet government itself now admits that. Among the 300,000 there is not a single Jew, but among the leadership more than 90% are Jews. Is this persecution of Jews, or is it not, in the truest sense of the word, persecution of Christians? Then you said you fought both loan capital and industrial capital, but you have fought neither the one nor the other so far. You cannot fight industrial capital. At most you can destroy it. Then you can begin to build it up again with 12-hour workdays, and you have never fought the other. That's the one that funds you. Then the second speaker explained that the cause of the revolution was only to be found in poverty. We would rather put it like this. Poverty made Germany ripe for those who wanted revolution. Read the writing of their lord and master Walter Rathenau, who even then ruled Germany, who explained precisely that the true and conscious practical purpose of the revolution was to oust the feudal system and replace it with a plutocracy. These gentlemen have been the financiers of this glorious movement. If their revolution had meant even the slightest danger to capital, then the Frankfurter Zeitung would not have announced triumphantly on November 9th, "The German people have carried out a revolution." Once we carry out our revolution, the Frankfurter Zeitung will be singing a different tune. Then you went on to say, before the war, one never heard anything about the Jews. That was a sad thing, that so little was heard. But that does not mean that they were not there. But above all, this is not even true, for this movement has not existed only since the war, but has existed just as long as there have been Jews. If you go back in Jewish history and read that the Jews gradually wiped out the original tribes in Palestine with the sword, you can imagine that there was anti-Semitism as a logical reaction, and it has existed all the time up to the present day. And the pharaohs in Egypt were probably just as anti-Semitic as we are today. If before the war you had not only read their famous writers Moritz, Salomon, and so on, and I do not mean newspapers which from the outset bear the stamp of approval of the Alliance Israelite, you would have heard that in Austria there was already a huge anti-Semitic movement, and that in Russia too the people were constantly trying to rise up against the Jewish bloodsuckers, that in Galicia the Poles groaned and no longer worked, and sometimes rose up in despair against these drunken idealists who were systematically ruining the people. Unfortunately, we have only begun to understand this too late. But you say before the war one heard nothing about it. But how sad are those who hear about it now and still don't have the courage to join with us? Then you go on to say that Lenin did make some mistakes. We are grateful that you at least admit that your Pope also made mistakes, but then you declare that you would not make these mistakes. First of all, if 300,000 people are hanged in Germany, if the whole economy in Germany is destroyed according to your pattern, then your statement that you would not make such mistakes means little. You have a poor idea of what the whole system of Bolshevism really means. It does not seek to improve the situation, but is there to destroy nations with these mistakes? If you declare today that this has been done in Russia up to now, then that is a sad excuse. If first a people is decimated, a national economy is brought to the brink of total collapse, and finally the state, which practically only exists by the grace of Tsarist officers, is forced to become imperialist and allowed to make conquests, then I declare that this is a peculiar policy. One thing I know is that if we do not have the iron will to stop the madness of war, that mutual mutilation, then we will perish. Finally, you explain that precisely because loan capital is international, we cannot fight it nationally, because otherwise the international world will shut us out from everything. These are the consequences of relying on international solidarity. If you hadn't made us so powerless, we could give a damn whether this other world is satisfied or not. But when you yourself admit that this international capital, which practically dominates Britain and France and North America, is in a position to close us off, do you then believe that the struggle against capital is being waged there? As long as this earth has stood, peoples have never become free through the will and deed of other peoples, but only through their own strength, or else they have remained slaves. And then, at last, you too turn to the Bible, and that at least is a good sign in a communist. And you explain to me that I am a communist because of a peculiar agreement between the Bible and our party program. What you assure me of here has already been assured to me by Dr. Gerlich, for example, and Mr. Hohmann called out to me. If you stand up for what you have in your program, you are a communist. Conversely, the Post constantly tells me that I am an arch-reactionary, a completely deranged militaristic regressive. The Post is itself reactionary. Would you please discuss that with the editor-in-chief and allow me to listen in? The Kampf also emphasizes again and again that we are a bastion of counter-revolution. So I recommend that you first go to the Post and to the Kampf and explain to them that we are communists, because I couldn't care less what they call me, whether a reactionary, a pan-Germanist, a junker, a heavy industrialist, or a communist. I am and will remain a German National Socialist, and I have my program before me, and as I said earlier, I will pursue it to the last spark of my strength and to the last breath of my lungs.